about family, about guests at your table, and I'm really sorry, I got a little busy. So we're gonna figure this out together. I also got too busy to eat breakfast, so hopefully you guys don't mind if I eat some breakfast while we're figuring this out. I can't do anything without my coffee. So, not family promise, I'm a little confused about this. Guest at Your Table is a program of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee where you have guests at your table. And they're in this box, and you have them at your table, and somehow you talk about them and their stories. Oh, their stories are in here. Okay. So their stories are in here, and you have them and you feed them in the box on the table. You feed them in the box on the table. Okay. All right, let's think about this. Oh, you put the food in the box. Okay. All right, I'm not sure how they're going to get it from the box, but we're just going to share my coffee with them.
Whoa, Trista, what are you doing here?
I'm putting the food in the box for the guests at our table.
I don't think that's really how it works.
But it says that we put the food in the box.
Yeah,
have some coffee.
No, I have my coffee, but thank you very much. That's very kind. But
I think they liked it.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to put the money in the box that we would use to feed them.
The money?
Yes, the money.
The money just, well, that makes a lot more sense, actually. So we put the money that we would feed a guest at our table in the box, not the food.
That's how it works.
Not the food. Oh yeah, because that doesn't look good anymore.
No,
I don't think they're going to want to have my coffee and my toast. Okay, all right. Okay, so we got it, right? So you guys, downstairs there are some boxes in the social hall, and you can pick one, and I will do us all a favor, and I'll take this one home. And you guys get a clean box and put it on your table. And throughout the holiday season, there are these people, and you can flip the box and change your guest around for your meals. And the stories about the people are inside of the pamphlets. So you guys can talk with your family and then say that the money that you would have paid to feed a guest, you will put in this box, or you can symbolically put it in the box and just keep track of it. And then you'll bring it all back to us in January, and we'll send it off and support the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, helping people change their stories into stories of hope. Sound good? Sound like a plan?
I think that sounds much better.
Okay, don't bring me any soggy boxes, you guys. Learn from my mistake. Today's reading comes from Lawrence M. Krauss. In his book, A University from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. The amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than the atoms in your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnace of stars. And the only way they could get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. And that's Lawrence M. Krauss's story, and that's my story too. One of the most frustrating movies I have ever seen is a movie called The Object of My Affection. It stars Jennifer Aniston, and that's not why it's frustrating, but it stars Jennifer Aniston as Nina, a New York social worker who becomes pregnant unexpectedly by a boyfriend she's not that crazy about. As her pregnancy advances, she becomes convinced that her gay best friend and roommate, George, would make first a better father for her unborn child, and second, a better boyfriend for herself. So Nina's boyfriend is furious that he's being replaced as a dad to his biological child, and he and Nina part on very hard terms. George is touched and thrilled to be asked to help raise Nina's child, but when Nina reveals her growing romantic attachment to him, George has to make it clear that he's not capable of returning her affections. The pivotal scene in the movie is when, immediately after the birth of Nina's child, Nina and George realize that because of Nina's strong feelings, not only can they not co-parent together, but George is going to have to move out of the apartment that they share before she and her daughter come home from the hospital. The scene ends with Nina mentally readying herself to parent alone, and Nina and George's relationship and friendship and closeness seemingly irreparably broken. And yet, the very next scene, 5 years later, we see Nina sitting in an audience next to her ex-boyfriend. They're very friendly with each other. The camera zooms out to reveal that Nina and her ex-boyfriend both now have spouses or partners, and all four of them are in the audience to watch their daughter's musical debut. And who is the person directing this kindergarten musical extravaganza? It's George. The final few minutes of the movie reveal that somehow George and Nina are best friends again. That George, while not a father to Nina's daughter, is considered the girl's uncle. Every main character in the movie has reached a place of peace and happiness in their relationships with each other. As the movie ended, there was a sharp sense of disappointment within me. While I liked the movie as written, the story I was more interested in was the one that took place in that flash of darkness that represented the 5 years between those two final scenes. How did the people in that story repair their relationships and move into harmony and joy in their new roles? What steps did they take that led them to that realized happiness? What choices did they make to change their story, and what choices do they continue to make to keep those changes adding up? I'm guessing that Hollywood producers didn't think that those small incremental changes made a very interesting story. We got the happy ending without seeing any of the work. But that story, the story of the work, is the story of our lives. And that movie is the one I want to see. The one that provides encouragement and pointers for making the kinds of sustainable changes that heal our relationships and make for a story of our own best lives. Several years ago, I had a friend who was preparing a speech she was about to give before a crowd that was anticipated to be several hundred people strong, if not several thousands. I asked her how she had come to be the kind of person who could speak to so many people, and she answered, "When they asked me, I said yes." Such a thing seemed inconceivable to me. It couldn't possibly be that simple. I have a confession to make. I am painfully shy. I am most comfortable talking to a handful of people at a time. Now, I am most comfortable talking to a handful of people in an entire week. I have interesting thoughts, but I prefer not to share them. I have a decent voice, but I usually stop singing when other people are around. In the story of my life, I am the quiet one, the mouse. And yet, here I am, giving a sermon, and not my first one, to an entire congregation, several handfuls, no, whole dozens of people, all at once. And not only that, but I've sung solos in concert. The story of who I am today is an inexplicable difference from the story of who I was 10 years ago. A cut between then and now would be as mysterious and miraculous as that movie's cut to the next fantastic future scene. And yet, it is that simple. When they asked me, I said yes. In the early 20th century, mathematician Alfred North Whitehead proposed something he called an ontology of becoming. Reality, he stated, was constantly in flux, made up of occasions of experience, things that people perceived as static, concrete objects were actually successions of occasions of experience. I experience this podium. I experience this podium. I experience this podium. I experience this podium. This podium is perceived by me to be a concrete object, but what I really know of it are my occasions of experience, my successions of occasions of experiences with it. According to Whitehead, the same is true of ourselves. The I that we perceive as ourselves is accumulation of all of our occasions of experience, both of the external world as related to us through our senses, and our interior world as related to us by our internal dialogue. Just as the podium is not a static object, neither is the I. We are not static. We are constantly moving through occasions of experience. Our movement determined by conscious and unconscious, large and small choices we are constantly making in reaction and anticipation of the changing experiences around us. Think of it as a strip of film. The repetition of a figure over and over and over with only minute changes each frame. Each frame is still and yet move them past you at speed, and it is no longer the film moving but the figure within it. It's no longer disconnected images but a movie, a story, a life. Between most frames, the change and movement is minuscule, and yet evolution occurs. Change happens. Slow it down, and we see that everything is in the process of becoming something different. Everything is a story, with the end scrolling away into the future. Even this podium. Eventually, this podium will be shown to have been becoming something different. Rotten wood, firewood, coal, a museum piece. That process, as it moves through occasions of experience, is not stable either. As I said a few moments ago, between most frames, the change and movement is minuscule, but between each frame, there exists the possibility for radical movement. If we're talking about a podium, the process of becoming could look like frame after frame after frame after frame after frame of the fibers of the wood slowly disintegrating, dust working into the tiny cracks and expanding them, and yet suddenly, between one occasion of experience and another, it could catch fire and speed up its process of becoming charcoal. Many years ago, in my Philosophy 101 class, we were presented with the following scenario in question. A person suffers a brain injury and loses all of their personal experiences and memories. They no longer remember anything of what they were. Are they the same person? Some of us argued that of course the person is the same person. They look the same as they did before, their loved ones claim them. A person is synonymous with the physical object they inhabit, even if they were disfigured in the accident so that they no longer even look as they did before. They possess an inherent singularity, a unique spirit that, while present, makes the changes irrelevant to their personhood. Others argued that it was not the same person. Their memories are gone, the experiences that made them who they are have been wiped away. Personhood is dependent upon experience, memory, and perception. They may be in the same body, but without the memories informing them of who they are not the same person. The positions seemed irreconcilable, but they both depend on an assumption that an object changed is no longer the same object. In the first instance, because the person was the same singularity, there had been no true change. In the second instance, because a radical change had occurred, the person was not the same singularity. But process philosophy, as the ontology of becoming came to be called, says that the radical change has occurred and that the object is the same singularity that was always already in the process of becoming that change. A podium, before falling and splintering into pieces, is the same singularity that is now known as and has a destiny of firewood. It's just that in that fall, the motion of becoming was made visible. Or to talk about our hypothetical case, the person is the same person both because the people surrounding them perceive them as the same singularity and because the person went through the process of becoming what they are now. But the person has been so altered by the process that they are now a different series of occasions of experience on their way to becoming something else. If objects, if we, are a collection of still frames moving, then every new frame carries the influence of all the frames before it and all the frames around it. We are held in stability by other people's experiences of us, while at the same time we transcend such experiences with the choices we make in relation to the occasions of experiences we move through. Because of the weight and ultimate direction of all the preceding frames, we can look back and see that we were always becoming what we are right now. Because of the primacy of free agency that takes place at the infinitesimal shift between frames, we are always already becoming something else entirely. I was talking about this with a person who was in the hospital, having been hospitalized after a suicide attempt. He was in the process of coming to terms with his alcoholism. I was attempting to give him hope in the ever-present possibility for change in his story. In despair, and convinced of the futility of change, he said to me, "Then how do you know I wasn't always meant to be an alcoholic?" To which I replied, "How do you know you weren't always meant to be a recovering alcoholic?" So he said, "How do you know I wasn't always meant to be a failure at recovery?" And I said, "How do you know? Yours isn't the story of someone who eventually succeeds at recovery after at first failing. How do you know you're not the plucky survivor who rises? As long as you're alive, for every time the story bends toward failure, there's a way to choose to bend it back to one where you're a survivor. The story is twisty, and it never ends. It is our job merely to move through, making the best decisions we can along the way, trusting the process." Whitehead, as he was formulating his process philosophy, made space for God within that philosophy. God, for Whitehead, as I understand, was not an omnipotent being removed from reality and the constraints of physics. God, too, was a series of occasions of experience, constantly moving and evolving. Because God is part of the universe of experiences, God cannot move against the laws that order the universe. God thus cannot coerce or force things. God serves as a persuader toward positivity, love, and justice, and a provider of experiences for growth that a person can either accept or reject. A saying attributed to process theology is that God has a will in everything, but not everything that occurs is God's will. Or, as I like to riff on an old saying, if the devil is in the details, God is in the process. Which makes us very close to God here in Unitarian Universalism. Free agency and the laws of the universe are supreme. Thus, God moves from the position of old man in the sky to the voice you hear in your head, urging you to evolve, to become more than yourself, more than the story you've been telling about yourself. Earlier, when I spoke of becoming a person who stands up, gives sermons, sings in front of groups of people, I stated that it happened because I said yes. What I didn't say is that I said yes hundreds of times. I chose over and over and over to become this person. Every time I stood at a podium, every time I spoke to a stranger, every time I introduced myself to a visitor, I chose to become this person. And sometimes I chose multiple times in rapid succession. On the Easter Sunday I gave my first sermon, I was convinced that the sermon I had written was completely worthless and terrible in its worthlessness. I had been writing a story of failure all night. At 4:30 in the morning, I gave up trying to make it better, and I went to bed to get a couple of hours of sleep to prepare myself for my mortification in the morning. As I entered the church, I saw the worship coordinator, and I nearly told her that I could not deliver my sermon. I chose not to do so. As I stood up with my sermon clutched in my nerveless hands, I nearly gave my closing words instead, as a way to call the service to an abrupt and early end. I chose not to. It was a hard choice. As I read my terrible sermon, at each pause between paragraphs and thoughts, I considered just looking up, shuffling my papers, and informing everyone that their time would be better spent talking amongst themselves. Still, I chose to plow on with my awful sermon. In those moments, I became someone who would deliver a terrible sermon despite knowing better. As I ended my sermon, I faced the choice of whether or not I would sing a song in front of everyone. Not only a cappella, but all alone, because everyone else I'd asked to sing that song had told me no. If you had asked me earlier in the week, without the weight of all of the frames of me standing up and delivering my terrible sermon, I would have said, no, I'm not singing this song. But now that I had become a person who could deliver a terrible sermon in front of hordes of people, I could become a person who would mutilate a song in front of those same hordes of people. Free agency interacted with the laws of inertia, and I became something radically changed to my former self. Imagine my shock when it turned out that instead of becoming a giver of terrible sermons, I had become someone who could write and deliver a sermon that people actually found helpful. For me, in retrospect, that tiny voice that urged me to say yes to the choice of whether or not to continue over and over at each period is the voice of God. But God, as envisioned by Whitehead and other process theologians, a provider of experiences, a persuader to positive change, an inner voice offering good advice instead of all of the negativity my inner dialogue almost always consists of. So having gone through all of this, I now understand why the movie Object of My Affection cut out all of those bits I was interested in seeing. The process of healing, repairing, and moving toward positivity is both too small and too large to show easily. It's a tiny voice in your head and the sweeping grand finale of all of your history, including the history of everyone who has influenced you. It's a series of occasions of experiences, a sequence of choices, a repeated yes to healing and change. A big blow-up fight is good drama. The quiet choice to nod a hello or reciprocate a greeting or take over some food is less exciting, but ultimately far more momentous. Which brings me to the first words of comfort to myself and to my friends and family I wrote after the election last week. About the small changes that I've noticed and started to cling to, the story I'm telling about myself and what I'm doing and seeing in promoting change in this world. I wrote, in 2012, when Trayvon was murdered, it was mostly just me, my friends of color, some of my white friends who are parenting or partnered with people of color, and some of my really, really liberal white friends not otherwise associated with people of color crying out at the injustice. But mostly my Facebook feed was filled with people talking about how he shouldn't have worn a hoodie, shouldn't have been there, probably deserved it, his choices brought him to that end. In 2014, when Eric Garner was murdered, when Tamir Rice was murdered, there were a few more lifting their voices to say their names and call out the egregious racism. A few less claiming that they brought it on themselves. This past summer, with each life taken, the outrage and the noise on my Facebook feed and in my real, actual life has grown. It's a small thing, but it feels like this incremental shift. But this story of incremental change is what we've got right now. It's a story of dozens of people, in my view alone, making an incremental shift in their stories, and through those tiny shifts, making a shift in our nation's story, even if we can't see it yet. So when you're feeling caught up in a story that no longer suits you, when you're swept along in a story that is overwhelming and feels like it's bigger, way, way bigger than yourself, when you feel like your story is taking you in the wrong direction, or that what's going on around you doesn't match your story, look around you at the things that you are in control of, where the small moments of change are located. Look at the breaks between the frames of film and make changes to your story, no matter how small they seem at the moment. Say yes to what you can say yes to. Say yes to what you can say yes to, except you're a little scared, so you're thinking that you're going to say no, but go ahead and say yes anyway. Say no to what you need to say no to. Make the shift and go beyond the story that you've been telling into the story you choose to tell. Remember that you are a miraculous fusion of star stuff that is in the process of becoming something unforeseen. But every choice now is a story of your own making.